Hello, welcome to the Sunoikisis session 6 of the Spring 2025 series. Today we're going to be talking about analysing and visualising texts. Today on the 27th of February. Hello to everybody watching us live right now. Hello also to everybody watching us later. So today we're joined by Kaspar Beelen from the University of London, and Megan Bushnell from the Oxford Text Archive to introduce the theory and practice of various digital methods for the exploration, analysis and visualization of historical texts. If you're watching live, do say hello in the chat, say where you're watching from, and if you have any questions at all during the session, do also put those in the chat, and we can answer those in the discussion at the end. So now I'm going to hand over to Kaspar to begin the session. Kaspar, I think you're still muted.
Am I still muted? Really? 1 second.
I just unmuted you. You're fine now.
Okay, I will go back. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this session. So we will be talking about text analysis, more specifically digital text analysis. And in this session, we will here I show you the outline. So what we will do is to do like a quick introduction to the general aims of digital text analysis. Then we delve a bit more deeper in the history and the background of this field. After which we will even delve a bit deeper and show you some case study which kind of show you the value of text analysis applied to real research scenarios. And lastly, this will be more like a hands-on part. We cover some more practical ground, and we have a look at Voyant Tools, which is like a really easy to use tool everyone can use to start doing digital text analysis. So this is to kind of get you started. So basically, we will be going from like more theory to more a practical view on digital text analysis. So let's start with text analysis. And I think one reason why suddenly we now have this kind of attention to analyzing digital text and this topic of big data in history is becoming more important is the issue of having more and more information available to us which we can study. And the question is then often, what can we do with this information? So the question I will start with, and I will kind of address over the next minutes basically, is how could one read 1 million of books? So I will try to kind of come to an answer to this question, because you know that practically, like even if you would start reading at a very young age, like this toddler here, there's only a certain amount of books you can read, and even if you read a lot, we still need to sleep, and our memory also has problems. So there's only so much information we can process by like closely reading texts. So this kind of puts a limit on the amount of information we can study. So the question is a bit, how can we go beyond this? How can we actually read or study more books than we can actually read? So this is a bit like the question, how can we study more information than we can actually read? And as humanists, or most of you are classicists, we are usually trained to analyze a fairly small and carefully selected set of sources. So we're very well versed in what is often called close reading. So we can work well with a small amount of information. But these techniques we use when you do close reading, when we do like this kind of contextualizing interpretation, doesn't really scale well to, let's say, large amounts of information. So how can we kind of scale? How can we use different methods to scale up our reading of sources? And a very popular answer to this question is the concept of distant reading. It has been coined by Moretti from Stanford, I think in the early 2000s, if I'm correct, or maybe like late 90s. And the idea is that he calls it a little pact with the devil. So we know how to read text. Let's now learn how not to read them. So he puts a bit in like this kind of contradictory way of reading by not reading, which he calls distant reading. And I will give you an example to make this a bit more clear in a second. But I think basically the elements of what is distant reading, or let's say which you could also call like digital reading of texts en masse, so text at a larger scale, is that instead of focusing on like specific sources, we will study those texts in different ways. And this we will do, for example, by foregrounding structures or patterns in a large collection of text. So this is not looking at an individual word or an individual book, but we are interested in, like, are there patterns in our data we could make kind of make visible or measure in some other way. And to do this, what you often need to do is this technique of dissolving text. So we will tear text apart. We will transport them to more abstract units. And what we will often do in digital text analysis is to kind of count words. And count words is actually a way of dissolving the text in word counts. So just count how often words appear in a text. And then also this becomes a more abstract way of looking at the text. And again, like, this is like a form of quantification. So we will, in distance reading, we will often read text or process text using automated methods for counting, or there are more advanced ways of doing this, but we will only, in this session, we will only look at the basics. So to give you a more concrete example of what distant reading is, and just to give you, distant reading is also often called like the abattoir of literature, especially because we will kind of destroy text, reconfigure them, and kind of transform them into something more abstract, and basically then look at the corpus again. So this is why it's kind of called this kind of abattoir, because we chunk it in small pieces. But to give you an example of distant reading more practically, so this is a visualization I made. It's based on something called Google Ngrams. And Google Ngrams, it's like based on Google Books, and basically it allows you to look at word patterns. And an Ngram is simply like a sequence of words. So unigram is just single words. So it allows you to look at word patterns over time. And this is actually quite a simple but quite a good example of distant reading, because what you do here, we look at the text en masse. So we kind of look at the totality of a corpus. We also, in the background, what we have done to obtain this kind of graph, we need to kind of dissolve the text. We need to kind of count the words. We need to quantify the information. So this is basically like we look at text in a more abstract way, not really at the page, but just at how certain elements, here words, appear across a large data set. And also we look at structure. So here the main structure is like time. So we can have look how text change over time, basically. So again, we are looking at patterns over time, but patterns in terms of like more abstract units, in this sense, words. So again, this is just like a very simple example of what distant reading could be. So the more abstract way of looking at large collections over time, and then trying to foreground certain patterns here. So I summarize this in the next slide, just to make clear why this is kind of reading without reading. So we are looking at a lot of text, but we're not actually reading any of those books. We just observe them through a very kind of quantificating lens. And of course, we have to be very critical about this, because you could say this also raises a lot of issues, like, can we use this as evidence? So as you've seen in this graph of Google Ngram, it seems that I will quickly show it again. So it seems that classic authors like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, those names, that those people get more popular over time. So it shows the frequency of those authors over the 20th century. So, but is this actually, can we actually say this based on this graph? And then whenever you do distant reading, it's very good to ask critical questions, like, what are you actually looking at here? And then we often go back to what is this based, actually, on are these results based? So basically, what does the corpus contain? So Google Books, for example, is mostly library collections. So this tells you a lot about anything you look at. What you will find basically is that there are maybe more and more scientific literature and libraries in the later period. So this maybe explains how Plato shows more an increase in the 50s, maybe not because people are reading it more often. So again, you have to be critical, like, what am I actually looking at? On what data is it based? And what does the data actually stand for? What does it represent? And also important is to look, if you look at this kind of extent, in this case, it's timeline, like, what do words mean? How ambiguous are they? And do they kind of change in meaning over time? So lastly, I would like to kind of explain in more bigger terms, if you are like a classicist or a humanist, and you would like to use text analysis? In what scenarios? Why is it useful? What are the bigger goals of, or the bigger aims of digital text analysis? And I would distinguish three parts. Like one is discovery, measurement, and interpretation. And these are the, you could say, the phases or the goals of doing digital text analysis. And discovery is actually really crucial, especially when you start any kind of inquiry into a corpus of text. You first need to get to know your data. And this might sound obvious, but it is often something that people forget. And this is also different, I think, when you approach a problem as a, let's say, in a more traditional way, where actually you know your data very well, and then you start interpreting your text. When you do digital text analysis, often this is not the case. You have a lot of data somewhere, and it's often quite hard to understand what is in there. So data is often like an opaque pool of information. And getting a sense of what's in there, understanding to what extent the data is biased, of what it is representative, is very hard to do. So trying to get a sense like what are the gaps, what are the silences in my corpus is really important when you apply text analysis to any data set, because your results will always be influenced by this. I think this is a nice example of what might go wrong sometimes. So this is a recent paper where like researchers are talking about large language models, and they say like, okay, we can just, what if we have a large language model trained on classical text? We can just talk to the ancient world. But you know, in many ways, this is wrong. Like a lot of people in our corpus are not captured in historical documents. So this is like a very naive understanding of how a corpus relates to the historical past. So, but I think it's a nice example. You can follow it up, but it's a nice example of how difficult it is to use data to say something about, let's say, historical patterns in the past. And a few examples then for discovery. So I think it's important when you search anything, like search, I think is something we often use, like keyword search, but you have to be aware that search is actually also a form of text analysis. When you search in a database or any kind of other platform, what it returns, this is based on a lot of like processing in the background. So in the background, what often will happen is that certain words will be removed. There might be weighted in certain ways. Your documents are always presented in a specific order. So even when you search, this is kind of doing text analysis where you have to be critical of like, why am I seeing certain documents? Why not others? Why are my documents ranked in such a way? And important there to ask, like, is my research reproducible? Can someone else have a look at the data and find the same search results as I have? So this is sometimes possible, sometimes not. But here it is important that this discovery, like search, is an essential part of discovery. And then actually what happens in search is actually based on like text analysis, which is often done for you, but still structures what you find and what you don't find. Another form of discovery is word clouds. We have a look at this a bit later, but word clouds is basically like what you can do is visualize words in a corpus based on their frequency. And then, for example, here this shows you the word clouds based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And this basically shows you the most frequent words in there, which kind of maybe corresponds somehow with the topic. So we will have a look at this later, but word clouds are a very popular way of trying to discover which words are prevalent, are characteristic of my data or my text. And then I think the most important, and where I will talk a bit more about, is measurement. Because often what we want to do in digital text analysis is kind of measuring some aspects of a text. So I think this discovery is something that we are quite comfortable with as humanists or like classicists, because we often go to archives. We know how to discover text. Measurements might be a bit more unfamiliar, but what we will often do in digital text analysis is to try to measure something across the certain text, and then try to use this to say something meaningful about historical change. So, for example, what I mean with measurement in this context is that we want to quantify a certain aspect of a text as a proxy for some concept. To give you a simple example, if you want to measure if a text is positive or negative, you could measure, does this text contain happy or unhappy words? Another kind of popular example is sentence length. So long sentences are often used as a proxy to say if this text is difficult or hard, difficult or easy to read. So I hope this makes clear, like by looking at some aspects of a text, by measuring some aspect of a text, which could be quantifying happy words, quantifying stop words, or measuring sentence length, you can measure something about the text and then use this for analysis later. And just to give you one example, which I really like, this is called the loudness in the novel, which is I provide a link here. It basically tries to measure how much noise is there made in certain parts of the book. So again, you can use certain words as a measure, like do people bang the door, do they shout, do they whisper? So this is something about that level of noise that is produced in the book. And by measuring those words, you can kind of measure the loudness of a text. And again, this is like a nice example of how you can use words to measure something, some aspects of text. And this is, I think, quite essential of the digital text analysis, why it is quite useful. But of course, you have to be aware that what you measure really, when you count something, that this really measures your concept of interest. And this kind of thing is called construct validity. So you need to, when I count happy words, am I really measuring happiness? This is often a difficult topic, but something we have to address explicitly. And then lastly, for this part of AIMD, you always want to go, the larger goal of text analysis is interpretation. So basically what you will do is you go from text to numbers and then back. So you will often what you do is to build a narrative to discovery and measurement. So you will try to quantify something, but then you always have to bring this back to an interpretation, to a narrative. And this is like often a circular process, like iterative. You want to measure something, and then you see, is this really what I'm finding? And you will kind of refine it. But like this, you always have to go back from text to numbers, and then from numbers again to a narrative of your text. I will now give the floor to Megan, who will talk more about history of digital text analysis.
You're muted, Megan. You've also lost your screen.
Oh, okay. So can you hear me now?
Yes, but you're not sharing your screen anymore. You've taken it away.
Oh, okay. Oh dear. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
Let's go present share screen. Okay. Is this okay?
That's great. Thanks.
Okay, so this section was originally kind of called the history of digital text analysis, and I realized that I was maybe going to wander a bit more around that necessarily. So I've kind of hit upon a title instead about kind of the context of it, kind of within both the kind of past 20 years and more generally. And then I want to talk to you a bit about working with historical data, which as classicists you are all bound to do. So first I want to introduce to you this concept of corpus linguistics. So many of the techniques that are used when applying distant reading and analyzing big data, many of these techniques have their roots in the field of corpus linguistics, which is the study of language in a written context, specifically a body of works, which is called a corpus. Corpus linguists digitally search or distant read these texts to find patterns in language use that may not be easily recognized in casual conversation or in a manual perusal of the same material. And they do this using a myriad of tools and techniques. The bread and butter of these is something called a concordancer, which is a piece of software that can search text in a variety of ways. So you have keyword in context, or quick. Quick search will allow you to see every instance of your search term within its broader context. So that's quite useful for distant reading. There are also things called collocation tools, which will allow you to find words that have a strong tendency to co-occur with your search term. And that can be quite useful for trying to figure out how your word is being used. And understanding, is it more likely to occur with one word rather than another, and what that means in terms of its general connotations. There are also keywords, which is a tool I like to use very much. So keywords are words that are found to be statistically distinct in one text sample compared to another. So they can be quite useful when you want to compare two texts and figure out what's different between them. And then there are n-grams, which are collocates that have become lexicalized. So these are words that occur so often together that they almost always occur together. So they're things like phrasal verbs, idiomatic phrases, that kind of thing. So the concordancer that we're going to be using today is Voyant Tools, but there are other tools that you might consider using, including something called AntConc, which I'm a big fan of, but is also a bit old now. And there's also Lanxbox, which is out of the University of Lancaster, and it's really, really exciting. They keep on further developing it and adding new features. The other thing that's really common in corpus linguistics is the concept of annotation. Linguists tend to annotate their text to make it easy to find certain aspects of language within their broader corpus. So some common forms of annotation include things like lemmatization, which group together different morphological inflections of the same word, part-of-speech tagging, which labels each word by its grammatical function, semantic tagging, which labels each word by its semantic category, such as, you could use semantic tagging to easily identify wherever animals are mentioned, for example, or maybe vehicles, or when certain emotions are present. It's very useful for that kind of thing. But there are other kinds of annotation as well. For example, in my own work, I've annotated the presence of narrative in speech, and I've tagged speakers by their gender, their status, and their nationality. So using these tools and techniques, corpus linguists can easily find the occurrences of specific words, grammatical patterns, semantic categories, and count the frequency of their occurrence. They can then run statistical analyses on these frequencies to determine what is standard language in this context and what is non-standard. So corpus linguistics, as we know it today, is a product of the 20th century, because it is closely intertwined with the development of the computer. However, there were many ideological precursors to the concept of distant reading, which I find really, really fascinating personally. So I'm going to subject all of you to that as well now. So I'd say that arguably the assembly of the great libraries at Alexandria and Pergamum and the creation of national bibliographies are kind of the first steps towards creating language-defining corpora and sort of creating these great big bundles of textual data. There are also some forms of fortune-telling and interpretation that involve transforming words into numbers, like with gematria, or the sortes Virgilianae or the sortes Biblicae, which involve just randomly opening either the Aeneid or the Bible onto a page and selecting a passage as an indicator of the future, which is kind of related to our idea of concordancing, of kind of reading non-sequentially, reading somewhat randomly. Word frequency started becoming an object of interest in the Arab world when it was discovered that frequency analysis could be used for code breaking. There's also, of course, the long tradition of textual commentaries that would include glosses on a text. And in time, we even had full-scale written biblical concordances and distinctiones, which would provide lists of where specific words appeared in the Bible along with their interpretation. These were extremely useful aids when it came to preaching and were all done manually. So just remember that when you're using a concordancer and you search for a specific word, the computer is able to find it immediately for you in all of its instances, but back in the Middle Ages, people were doing a lot of this painstaking work by hand. So thank goodness for computers. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and because I could go on, and there are some more modern developments that predate the computer that I think are also relevant, but I think you get the point. There's basically been a long-standing interest in reinterpreting language as numbers and reconstituting meaning computationally that in some ways has fed directly into the development of corpus linguistics as a field and text analysis as a method. So text analysis can be used for a wide variety of texts, medieval texts, modern texts, books, social media, inscriptions, papyri, audio video recordings, and so on. It really is very applicable. In classics and philology, however, your focus will almost always be on historical texts. And given this, it's really important that you're aware of some health warnings when it comes to dealing with historical data. First off, your data is likely going to need some additional processing before analysis. Older texts tend to use non-standard language, which makes word searching more difficult. Because you can't count on one search term being able to locate all instances of that term in your corpus. There might be numerous different ways your author or your multiple authors in some cases have spelled this word. So that can be quite tricky to get around. So what you'd probably want to do in that situation is you'd want to normalize and potentially lemmatize your corpus. However, if you're working with a more obscure language, which again is a common occurrence in older texts, you may find that there are few automated tools that are available to you to implement this kind of normalization or any other kind of a large-scale textual annotation. So for example, I do a lot of work on medieval Scots. There aren't any tools available for lemmatizing medieval Scots. That's something that you have to either do by hand or you have to use already existing tools for other languages and adapt them to your own, which isn't always ideal. So these are things to keep in mind. The second big problem is that digital texts are removed from their physical context. They're divorced from their materiality. And for modern texts, this isn't necessarily a massive issue, especially for content that's actually born digital and doesn't necessarily have that material context. But again, for modern texts, it's not necessarily a big problem because we're intuitively aware of their physical context. We understand how books work today. We know what the experience is just from our own experience. However, for historical texts, this can be a bigger problem because our current cultural context differs from the historical cultural context, and it's not something that automatically informs our worldview. Our idea of what a book is today is not the same as what a book was considered to be in the past, or even what a text was considered to be. Consequently, it's really important to realize that a digital historical text has not just been separated from its material context, but also its historical context, its linguistic context, if it's been translated or normalized, and its cultural context. So it's important that you find ways to reconnect with these contexts. Otherwise, your analysis is going to be rather shallow. But that is to go back to what Kaspar is saying, that's going to be all part of your interpretation about thinking about ways how to link together what your analysis has been telling you from the distant reading and linking that back to the historical context. Finally, corpus linguistics struggles with a problem with representation in the sense that language is infinite and varied, and corpora by their nature are not. You're never going to have a corpus large enough really to properly represent language. I mean, they try with ChatGPT, but we know instinctively that there are biases and there are problems with that sample of language. So it's really difficult for a corpus to be representative of all language use, as opposed to just a narrow arbitrary slice of languages written in. Again, you can try and get around this by having a very large corpus, but with historical data, you're probably not going to be able to do that because that data is just not available. So you can't really rely on big data, nor are you necessarily spoiled for choice when it comes to sampling different genres from a wide variety of sources. You're kind of just stuck with what you have. Consequently, you can't really, this will limit how broadly you can argue a point within your digital analysis. You can't necessarily argue that something that you have found in your data set holds true for the entirety of the language that you are working in. Your conclusions need instead to be restricted to the scope of the evidence you have access to. However, I mean, that doesn't mean that your conclusions are less valid or important. It just means you need to think carefully about how far you stretch your conclusions. Now, while corpus linguistics is primarily used as a means to gather evidence of specific kinds of language use or language change, it and its related methods can be used to benefit other fields as well. Digital text analysis can be used for literary analysis and stylometry, which involves the statistical profiling of an author's language use. It can also be a useful tool when creating scholarly editions, especially digital scholarly editions. This is really the kind of work that I like to do. However, these methods can also be used in the analysis of historical documents to generate data that might be useful for historical analysis and social science. And these methods are also integral to many more advanced computer science topics, such as natural language processing, large language models, machine learning, and AI. In other words, even if you're not a linguist, or even a humanist, text analysis is a method that has a great deal to offer and a lot of potential. And I think now we can hand over. I'm going to stop sharing. I hope that's the right thing to do.
No, don't stop sharing because you'll need to share again later. But anyway,
okay.
That's fine. Yes, who's up next?
I think it's you, Gabby.
Oh, okay, thank you. In which case, I will move to my screen. Yeah. So I'm going to just very briefly show a couple of visualizations from a case study, which is an ancient Greek text, the multi-volume work on the nature of animals by Beelen, which is a text that we looked at in more detail in a session where we presented Voyant Tools and various other approaches back in 2022. So if you want to see in more detail about this particular text, there's a whole session on this, which is linked at the bottom of this slide. And it's this session which has various information in there, which includes links to the text that you can download. So there are 17 files in a single zip archive with one file per book on the nature of animals, and also a single file containing the entire 17-volume work, but just in the lemmatized forms. And we talked a few weeks ago about how to potentially use regular expressions or other approaches to create a lemmatized version of a text from something like the linguistically annotated diaresis annotated ancient Greek corpus. So if you wanted to create your own lemmatized version of something in the way that we've done here, that's something that you've seen a few weeks ago. We talked about then. But I've also got here links to the visualizations themselves, which I will show here briefly. So the first thing just to note is that the first visualization I'm showing is the unlemmatized version. So every word in this visualization is as it appears in the text. You'll see the distinction between this and the lemmatized version in a moment. The first difference is that we have in here, if you can read Greek, you can see to, ton, ten, ton, tu, tes. These are all the articles in various different cases and numbers, and all of these words just mean the, right? But it's depending on the case of the noun that this article is going with. As a result, all of those are fairly small. This is the word cloud that Kaspar mentioned earlier, showing you the most frequent words. And the most frequent word is kai, and. That turns out more than any other word. It turns out multiple times in a sentence. It's a much more frequent word in Greek than it is in English. So this word appears all the time. Much more frequent than the word the, than any of the individual words for the. When we ran, instead of the original text, we had the lemmatized version of the text. So every word in the deeply inflected Greek text had been replaced with its dictionary headword, and we do the same visualization we see that there's now one word, ho, which is the masculine nominative singular of that article, has replaced all the others and is now bigger than kai. It's more frequent than the word for and. So the actually is a much more frequent word, but we didn't see that in the previous one because of all the different words for the that were scattered around there. So that's just a sense. Sometimes you'll want to lematize, sometimes you won't. This is one of the advantages of lematizing. The other thing I just want to show briefly is I'll do this on the lematized version, is that once we've got all this, you're basically seeing that all of the words on this list are small words. They're very common words. They're what we sometimes call stop words. They tell us nothing about the text. Kaspar mentioned how we can sometimes see what a text is about by looking at the word cloud. Here we can't. We can see, the, and, various other words, pronouns and things like this in there, the word to be. None of this tells us what this text is about. We'd have no clue that this text was about animals just from looking at that list. For some things like authorship attribution, this is a really useful kind of language to be studying, but for other things it's not. So one of the options, which we'll see in more detail these options in a minute, I'm just going to use the ancient Greek stop words list that is native to Voyant, which means that all those stop words, words that are very, very common and are not normally meaning-bearing, they're grammatical words rather than important words in the normal sense, have now been eliminated from this list. We now have a slightly more useful list. We have words like fish, dog, man, various other, horse, big, see, I hear, things like this turn up in the list. Life forms, animals turning up. Seeing this list, you might now suddenly think, maybe this is a text about animals, right? It's become a more useful list of words. And the final visualization I'm going to show is I'm going to move over to the relative frequencies across the text. And this is using the unlematized version, which is slightly less useful for what I'm doing, but it is divided into 17 books, whereas the lematized version is not. That's just because of the data that I have. I could clean up the data better to get a better version of this. But I've just chosen 5 words, and these are the most frequent form, respectively, of the words for fish, human, bird, elephant, and dog. They're the most 5 frequent animal words I could find on the list. And this just shows the relative frequency of each of those words in each of the 17 volumes of the book. Now, the reason this is an interesting thing to look at is that, as any scholar of Eilion's on the nature of animals will tell you, he talks about animals pretty randomly throughout the book. So, one book will have examples of something related to one fish, something related to a bird, something related to something else, and then he'll flip back and forth across the books. It's not clear that he has any. He certainly doesn't have any sort of taxonomic structure. He doesn't have any particular structure as to when he's talking about animals living in the wild, when he's talking about animals and their relationships to humans, when he's talking about animals as food, when he's talking about animals mating habits. He just skips all over the place. So it's pretty random. Looking at this, you can start to think, well, maybe he's talking a lot about which is this one. He's talking about a lot of birds in this book and a few birds in this book, but then in this book here he's talking much more about fish and a lot less about dogs. And you can start to see, well, actually he's talking about dogs a lot, especially when he's not talking about some of these other animals, like this is, sorry, I can't necessarily tell the difference between the two darker colors on there. But if there are frequently peaks in one color and troughs in another color, you can start to say he talks about dogs the most when he's not talking about elephants. Now, maybe that's not meaningful, but it is a pattern, whereas before we claimed there were no patterns in Eilion. So it's one possible way of sort of playing around with the visualization. You can then go back and look more closely, right? You can actually read the thing. So I'm not reading millions of words here. I'm reading one work in 17 books, but I'm already seeing patterns that I can start to say, well, okay, normally we say there's no patterns. is that true? Is this just random view of patterns? I could choose different words to compare to each other. I could do different sort of exploration, but you get the idea. I'm possibly seeing things that I don't see at the detail of reading every single word in the work. So that's about all I want to say for my case study. I'll hand back over to whoever's next.
And I think that's me. Let me just share again. So hopefully you can see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Case study 2.
Yes, excellent. So for this case study, I'm just going to tell you a bit about some work I did on a translation of the Aeneid that focuses on sort of repetitions within the Aeneid. So it's fairly well known that Virgil repeats content throughout his epic poem, and here's just one example. In book 1, Juno promises to marry Aeolus to a nymph of hers. And then in book 4, Virgil has her repeat the same exact phrase when promising Venus to marry Aeneas to Dido. And Virgil's use of repetition is really subtle. He rarely repeats things more than once, and his repetitions tend to happen across books, which makes it really hard for the traditional reader to catch these repetitions. As a result, traditionally, these repetitions were seen as accidents or mistakes, as if the great poet Virgil would never do something so tacky as to repeat content. However, scholarship from the later 20th century began to reevaluate this position and has argued that repetitions are intentional and that they serve a poetic purpose. So Walter Moskalew performed a full survey of these repetitions in the 1980s, but he did it manually. You can, in fact, use corpus linguistic tools to help find these repetitions much more quickly and more thoroughly. And we're doing that using n-grams. So as I previously mentioned, n-grams are collocates that have become lexicalized, and concordancers are able to find n-grams by cycling through a corpus, comparing every sequence of n number of words to the next sequence of n number of words to find a sequence that repeats. As you can imagine, this can take an awful lot of processing power, especially for large corpora. Now, I use the concordancer AntConc, which has a really handy n-gram tool, but you can also use Voyant Tools to find n-grams. So for AntConc, you would load in your corpus files, then you'd select the clusters/n-grams tool, and then select the n-grams checkbox under search term. And then you can then set your parameters for the size of the n-gram you want. I've chosen between 4 to 10 words. And then you can also choose the minimum frequency. I've chosen 2 to indicate that, yes, there's a repetition. And then you can select the minimum range, which is the range is the number of documents in your corpus that the n-gram appears in. So I've chosen, in this case, just 1. You would then select Start to get a list of repeated sequences of words that appear throughout the text. Notice that there are a lot of repetitions of results here, and this is because a 5-gram or a repeated segment of words that are, consist of 5 words. A 5-gram is also a 4-gram, which is also a 3-gram and a 2-gram. So if you look at the Comai et Vox Faucibus, you can see that that is repeated twice because there's also that word hycet in there. So these are evidence actually of the same repetition. For Voyant, the process is actually easier. You just need to upload your corpus and then go to the phrases tool. Oops, sorry. Don't have the same kind of highlighting for this example, but never mind. So you need to go to the phrases tool, which is a tab on the summary window. Voyant is a little bit more sophisticated here because it has an overlap function where you can ask Voyant to strip out the smaller n-grams that make out a larger one. So you don't have that same repetition of results that you get in AntConc. However, Voyant Tools does not recognize n-grams that don't repeat in a single document. which makes it really challenging to use in this example because Virgil rarely repeats lines within the same book. They're usually in separate books. So for this example, I had to combine all my corpus documents into one document to get Voyant to work. But that's just an example of the kind of workarounds and hacks that you sometimes need to do to get certain software to work with your texts. So using this kind of n-gram tool, I was able to find 91 instances where full lines have been repeated across the Aeneid. So the diagram on this slide shows where repetitions occur between books, with a thicker line indicating more repetitions, and circles in bold indicate where repetitions occur within the same book. So a full qualitative survey of these repetitions reveals that repeated segments tend to share contexts and form subtle illusions. For example, in the previous example I showed, where Juno arranges a marriage for Aeolus and then a marriage for Aeneas, the repetition helps to foreshadow how Aeneas's marriage is doomed. Aeolus' marriage results in shipwreck for the Trojans, while Aeneas's marriage results in Dido's death. Repetitions can also indicate shared themes between connected books. For example, the link between books 5 and 9 indicate a shared interest in chivalric competition, which takes the form of funeral games in book 5, but actual warfare in book 9. These books also feature members of Aeneas's crew more heavily, and they focus less on Aeneas. Finally, Virgil on occasion composes whole passages made of repetitions that refer to disparate parts of the poem. There are 29 separate instances where repeated segments occur within 10 lines of one another. So the example on the slide is the end of Mercury's admonition of Aeneas in book 4 and Aeneas's reaction to it. And it's made up of a series of repetitions that connect it to other parts of Virgil's text, where divine figures interfere in mortal events. In this way, echoes of Mercury's speech resound throughout the Aeneid, serving as a subtle refrain that emphasizes certain themes throughout the work. One of these is the god's investment in the creation of Rome, and another is that Aeneas is driven by divine mandate rather than personal desire. So with Virgil's repetitions identified, along with their various characteristics, we can then go on to track these repetitions across various translations of the Aeneid to investigate how translators interact with these repetitions, if they're able to recognize them, and if they bother to recreate them. So one such translation is Gavin Douglas's translation of the Aeneid, called the Aeneados. This is the first full translation of the Aeneid in the British Isles and was composed in Edinburgh in 1513. It's written in Older Scots, a language closely related to Middle English, but with its own syntax, morphology, and lexemes. So an n-gram analysis of the Aeneados reveals 257 repeated segments of at least 5 words, 54% of which are motivated by the source. Another way of looking at this is just to say that Douglas translates about 25% of Virgil's line length repetitions in the Aeneid. And this is really, really impressive because by contrast, commentators like Servius only recognize about 6% of Virgil's repetitions, and later translators like Dryden only recognizes about 7%. And this tells us that Douglas is a really keen reader who is reading specifically for these kind of structural concerns. It also tells us that he may have been translating each book of the Aeneid while using the others as reference, or maybe had so much of the text memorized that he was able to easily recall and recognize repetitions, which again tells us a lot maybe about his cultural context and the kind of education a man of his status had at the time. So yeah, that's just a nice example of what you can do with a tool like n-grams. I'm ready to hand over.
Yes, thank you. I will do the last case study 3. Can you hear and see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So case 3 is something totally different because I'm more a historian of like post-war history. So, but I think it will show some of the principles we alluded to earlier in a concrete example. So what I've been studying is like the gender and politics in Westminster, like the British House of Parliament after the Second World War, in a paper called A Feminized Language of Democracy. And basically what we were interested in is to kind of understand how Parliament changes when you have more female MPs entering, in our case, the House of Commons. So to what extent? So there's a big literature. To what extent does having more women MPs in Parliament change what is being taught, change the topics of discussion? And a very important theory here is often the politics of presence. It kind of states that if you have more women in Parliament, this will also change their representation in terms of what's being talked about. And this is then called substantive representation in the sense that it will give more attention to women's priorities and women's experiences and identities, things that cannot be kind of represented by men in a certain sense. So this has been quite a debate, and what we have been doing is to analyze the totality of speech in British Parliament after 45, based on the Hansard, which is basically like a verbatim record of every word that has been uttered in the House of Commons, which is like a large corpus. I think it's like multiple millions of words. So basically, what we did in the first study is to kind of get a sense. We want to measure to what extent does a speech talk about women. And again, here this is kind of this idea of measurement. Like we want to measure to what extent are women present in a politician's speech. So one thing what we did in the most simple example I will talk about now is to kind of measure the presence of certain words. Like to what extent does an MP talk about women, mothers, girls? So we looked at very specifically gendered words to get a sense to what extent is this like, does this speech represent women or not? So, and then we looked at it in relation to an MP's background. So we also had information like about the person talking. So we knew the gender of the politician and their age and where they were elected. So basically, this was the thing we want to study, like what the speech is about and how does this relate to the background of the speaker. So firstly, we kind of look like if there are more women in parliament, does this increase the attention given to women in political speeches? And here in Britain, like the year 97 is quite important. It's the Blair election, which I think then doubled the number of female MPs in parliament. And what we saw that actually it didn't really have an effect on what's being talked about. So even though there were significantly more women after 97, women as a topic of political discussion actually did not increase as much. It was way more important before, when women in parliament were actually very much a small minority in even smaller minority in parliament. So in this way we could say like maybe there's not so much about this relationship between number of the gender of the MPs and to the extent it gets attention in parliament. And then we also had a bit of a breakdown about behind these results. So I think what is interesting here, so here we can compare the extent to which female or male MPs talk about women, and the orange bar shows the kind of relative frequency of a speech being about women. And we can see that in this sense that there is like a relationship, like it tends that women MPs tend to talk way more about women's issues. However, this actually changes after 97. So we kind of see that this kind of strong correlation, this strong association between gender and topic of the speech kind of gets less after 97. And there are some other results. For example, we couldn't really find a very strong kind of relationship between ideology and talking about women in parliament. So it seemed more like when MPs were in opposition, they would more likely talk about women than they were in government, for example. So actually, there were some years that conservative MPs talked more about women than Labour MPs, especially when they could be in opposition. And lastly, we also looked a bit like what are the things that women and men talk about in parliament? What are the words they mention way more? For example, the word child and health are things that women talk more about, while argument, force, defense are more the male words. And actually, the interesting thing is that this is not really surprising, but what was surprising to us is how persistent this difference was. So these differences persisted over the whole post-war period. So there was like a kind of quite big discursive gap what women and men talked about in parliament over the end of the second half of the 20th century. So this is the third case study. I will now, in the last part, I will turn to introduction to Voyant Tools, and we already have seen many of the concepts and actually the interface of Voyant. But it's still maybe nice to show you quickly how you can get started with Voyant Tools and how you could apply this to your own texts. And I will use an example, Josephus, as an and again, I don't speak any classic language or read any classic language for that matter. So I use the English translation of Josephus, but you can actually also apply this with other texts as well, for sure. So if you want to use Voyant Tools, it's very easy. So I think one reason why we decided to do the demo here based on Voyant Tools is it's a very easy to use tool. It runs in a browser. It doesn't require any installation. You can just go to this webpage, voyanttools.org, and then you will be able to explore your own text. And I will now show you how this works. If you go to voyanttool.org, you will see this. Can you see this Voyant Tool screen? Just make sure. Okay, perfect. So what you see here is like the Voyant Tool webpage, and this is actually the page through which you can upload data. And there are various ways of doing it, and somehow the easiest way it could be, so I will just show you quickly the easiest way to enter text is you can just copy paste it. So I went to Gutenberg and I pasted a piece of Josephus text in here, and I can then do reveal, and then this brings you to Voyant, the interface. But this is a very small piece of text. It's actually not that useful. What I find very useful is what you can do with Voyant Tools if your text is online. So if you are using an online corpus and you have your text available, for example, in it's called raw text format, you can just copy paste the link. So here I'm copy pasting the link in here, and if I then click reveal, it will automatically grab the text from the website and use it. So actually, I find it quite easy to when my texts are online, I can just copy paste the link. A third way of using Voyant, and I'm showing this because everyone has like different data and from different sources. So what you can also do is to go to upload here, select upload, and then you can also kind of select a file from your local a file you have locally on your computer. So here I said upload. I choose this text, and then it will upload the text, and it will bring you to the main Voyant interface. So anyhow, I mean, whatever is most convenient for you. But in any case, what you will end up here is this interface here, and as you see, Voyant consists mainly of 5 different panels. And I like to think that these panels, we have talked about the concept of distant reading. I think these panels each give you a view on your corpus from a different distance. So you can zoom out very much or have a closer look. And I will use this metaphor throughout the session, because I think what makes Voyant really attractive is that it gives you this look at data from different distances, from very abstract to just looking at the text itself, like from close by. And each of those panels function in a different way to give you a different view on your data. And I will first show you just how it works with one text, and then I will show you how you can how you can use it for multiple texts. But just to start, I think I won't show every functionality because this will be too long, but I just want to give you a big overview and some intuition of how to use it. So an interesting element of Voyant is not only does it give you like a different kind of view, it also, all these panels are also connected. So if for example, I click on Romans, you can see, for example, that now this panel changed. and it showed me the relative frequency of the word Romans over the text. If you do a lot of things in Voyant and you get kind of lost and you don't know how to go back to your original screen, you can actually just click refresh, and this will put everything back to the original settings. So talking a bit more about the functionalities, I think a very popular one is this kind of word cloud called the Cirrus panel. And you see the word cloud kind of shows you the most frequent words. I mean, I will come back to this later, but it shows you frequent words, and the size, basically the size shows you how typical this word is for this book basically. And it will try to put bigger words at the center and smaller words more outside. So often this gives you a bit of a intuition what is the text about. But I also like it because it often can point us to things that maybe we might not be obvious when we read the text. So it might be, for example, that maybe some things are actually more present than we actually thought. So again, this is like an example of discovery. We can use word clouds to discover elements or patterns in a text, for example. So for example, I think like the word time actually is just very actually quite frequent. So why is it? Maybe it's something I haven't really paid attention to when reading Josephus. So what I can do is to click on the word time. And then again, you see like where the word appears over the text, but you could also, for example, then go to the middle panel, and this is called the reader. And then you can, for example, go there and look actually how this word actually appears in the text. So again, here I hope you can see all these panels are connected, and they each give you a view like at a different distance. So the word cloud gives you it in relation to other frequent words. Here you can see how often it appears over the book. And here you see in the center, you kind of see the actual examples of the word time. Something else that is important to say here is, I said this was this were the most frequent words, but what Voyant actually does in the background, especially when you work with English, it will do some filtering here. So it is a bit the opposite as what Gabriel has shown. It will automatically delete the stop words, like this kind of function words, like words that don't have kind of semantic meaning but are used more for grammatical reasons. So in one way, this might not always be what you want. So what you could do, I would show you again, is you could click here on define options for this tool. And here you see stop words. And you can either edit this list. You can add stop words if you think, okay, maybe the word it said the word came, for example, could be like a stop word. So I can edit this to the list. What I can also say, if I want to see everything, I could say none, confirm, and you will see that now I see all the words basically, and you see that this is totally different. This is actually maybe less interesting from a topical point of view. It doesn't tell us what the book is about, but almost for any book you look at, you will see the same stop words as the main word. So and will be almost frequent in any English text, and D as well. So let's go back to the original. I can use my user defined list confirm. So okay, I deleted some words, and I can. Sorry. So now I have again the original word cloud. So a few more things. So I hope this was clear that you can look at this text from different like angles. What is also very interesting, and you see here at the bottom of some of the panels, you have like some search boxes. You can, for example, type here. So for example, I was interested like, when does Josephus use the word wicked, and when does he use the word like righteousness? Like what's this kind of moral discourse basically? So what you could do, for example, here is wick. For example, if I use wick and then a star after it, this is like a wild card. So basically this will match, it's a bit similar like lemmatization. It does all a bit the same, like it will kind of match any word that starts with wick basically. This is wicked, wickedness, wickedest. So if I want to find all those words, I will choose wick and a wildcard. And now you see the frequency of any variation of wickedness over the corpus. can also do the same with right. And now you see, for example, now I'm kind of comparing a bit like where does Josephus talk about righteousness, where does he talk about wickedness? And then again, I think this is also a bit like both you kind of measuring maybe the moral tone of the text, but also it's nice for exploration because you can see maybe here in this part of the book, he talks more. He talks way more about righteous people than about wicked people. Well, then here he switches more to talking about wicked people. So there seems a bit like a bit of an inverse relationship between those terms, I think. So this is maybe a nice thing you could explore. And these are also patterns that become more visible once you do this kind of digital text analysis. It's really hard to notice this when you read a book from up close. A few more examples. What I would like to show is the terms here. So you can actually, this is quite nice again for exploration. Like if you see an interesting word like juice, basically what it will do, it will show you where in the text does this word appear, the collocates, and again the collocates are a bit like words which are kind of attracted to each other. They tend to co-appear close to each other. So Jews tend to appear closer to Romans because probably Josephus talks a lot about them in relation to each other, great, and so on. And also you get like the engrams, the phrases that in which Jews appear at the start. So again, this gives you a bit like what are the common long phrases that this word appears in. So again, this allows you to contextualize the word a bit better, like not just looking at the frequency, but also get a bit of a sense like how does it appear and in what context is it used. This is also done by the links. So basically what you see here is like the words in blue are kind of very frequent keywords in the text, and the words in orange are kind of the collocates. And so each of those words are nodes and they're connected with each other if they kind of collocate with each other. So for example, the word great, again, and Jews are collocates, the Jews and Romans are also collocates. So you can see, again, this allows us to investigate words not just in isolation, but get a more sense like about their context and their meaning and how actually Josephus is using them. One last example I would like to show you now, and then I will give you the example of loading multiple text, is you can also do concordance here. So this is what Megan has also talked about. So you can zoom in on one word. For example,
Kaspar, can you make the text any larger, or maybe make that whole app slightly larger, because it's very hard to read on this screen.
Okay, I can try it. Sorry. So I will. I'm not sure actually. I can't really. 1 second. I can. So I'm not sure if I can make the text much larger. Sorry, it's not like. Ah, wait. I can maybe. So I can, yes. So yeah, this is better.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
So for example, this is like kind of a concordance or keyword in context. So basically what you can do here is to zoom in on a word. And for example, or like a word or like a topic, for example, like wickedness. And then you get all the occurrences of this word next to each other. And I think this is really nice when you want to really, again, maybe you read something, you see, oh, this word is interesting, and then you can quickly kind of dive in, see all the occurrences of this word next to each other, and get a better sense of how actually does the author use this concept. You can give more context by clicking here, so you can get a bit more kind of because often like you need like a bit longer fragments to really kind of understand what's going on. You can also order it. So I think one interesting way is often to order it like by the left. So basically, this will show you, 1 second. Sorry, I need to make this a bit shorter now. So now you actually order it alphabetically by the left word, for example. So this also allows you, for example, to quite quickly find different ways that he might be using this word. For example, he often uses it in combination with their wickedness. It's often like ascribing something wicked to his opponents. But again, this allows you to quite quickly get a sense of how is this word used and how can it support my research. So what I would like to do lastly is to show you how you could, what changes when you add multiple texts. So what I will be doing now is to go back to the initial Voyant screen, and I will upload two texts, Antiquities of the Jews and the Wars of the Jews. And upload both. Again, that takes a second. So, 1 second, I will. So I think what's nice when you kind of have multiple texts, you can actually quite quickly switch between different texts in your corpus. For example, if you go down here, we're now looking at the word cloud, and it has a scale button. So now this word cloud is based on all the words in both texts. For example, if you would like to focus on like one book, you can quite quickly switch. So now we are looking at the Wars of the Jews, and then I can now switch to the Antiquities of the Jews. And again, I think this kind of contrastive element is really nice because you can quite quickly see which words are kind of more particular to one book compared to the other. And this is something you can quite easily do in Voyant by switching between different sets in your text that you have loaded into Voyant. One other thing that changes, for example, is if you now previously the part on the right showed you how a word appeared over the text, but now it shows you how often a word appears in two texts. So the relative frequency of one word across two texts. So here I'm looking at the word wickedness, and it seems that the word wickedness appears more often in Antiquities than in the book about the war. So again, this is something you could kind of, I can also, for example, add the word righteousness, see if the pattern holds. Wait, sorry. So this kind of shows a bit that the word righteousness actually, I mean, there seems to be like an opposite thing happening here. So this might be quite interesting to investigate as well. So again, I hope that this shows you that by Voyant allows you to really kind of compare and contrast text, and through those comparisons and contrasts, it actually maybe interesting things emerge, and then you can delve deeper into them. Lastly, I will show you this panel at the bottom left, the summary panel. So basically, these are the most, I talked about different distances. I think this is the most abstract kind of summary of the data. So basically, here you see a more abstract kind of numbers about both texts. So basically, what you can see here is, I mean, document length is maybe not very interesting. It just shows you that the Antiquities of the Jews is longer, twice as long as the War of the Jews. But more interesting kind of measures, again, I'm talking here about things we kind of try to measure, is vocabulary density. And basically here we kind of look at how difficult or how complex is the language. And in vocabulary density, basically what we do is we look how many words are there in the text and how many unique words are there in the text. And we kind of, so basically what's the vocabulary of Josephus in the text. And we kind of divide the number of unique words by the total number of words. So you can imagine if every word I use in a text is unique, then this would be one, because the vocabulary is the same as the length of the text. So the higher the number, the more difficult or more rich or more eloquent someone is based on their vocabulary, how higher the density. So you can see that the Wars of the Jews has like a higher vocabulary density than the Antiquities. And another score is kind of called readability index, and this kind of says how difficult. This is a more standardized score to say how difficult is a text to read, which also kind of confirms that the War of the Jews actually is a more difficult text than the Antiquities of the Jews. So I hope this is a very quick overview of some of the functionalities. You'll see here when you can also compare like what are the distinctive words shown here. So there's way more to NCONC than I've shown now, but I hope it gives you some intuition of some of its uses, how you can load text and how you can start discovering elements in there or analyzing the text. So I think this is it from me with respect to Voyant.
Great, thanks, Kaspar. I just want to sort of raise one small thing as an introduction to our first question. So you were talking about stemming as a sort of surrogate for lemmatizing, which works very well in languages like English or French, which are quite lightly inflected languages. So if you say walk star, you'll find walk, walks, walked, walking, pretty much every form of walk that you could possibly want to find. Whereas this works less well for more heavily inflected languages like Latin and Greek or German, where sometimes changes to the word occur at the beginning of the stem or in the middle of the stem. We have a lot of strong verbs in English, for example. Bring becomes brought rather than bringed, and so forth, and in Greek and Latin even more so. So that's sort of the difference between different kinds of ways of normalizing the text that might work differently in different languages. You could probably write a regular expression which would use some variant of stemming to I mean, you don't need to lemmatize some words in Greek and Latin, many words, but some would be more complex, too complex for that. But so I just say that by way of and so therefore Kaspar's illustration then of searching for wick, all the forms of wickedness, wicked, etc., as a form of lemmatization. So that sort of search and that sort of showing variation across the text and showing collocations and showing keywords in context, all of those things. There's a strong argument for the fact that doing that across a lemmatized text would get you more useful results than not. And I say this because Elizabeth asks the question effectively, in what sorts of cases would you lemmatize and in what sorts of cases would you not? So I don't know if anyone wants to talk about a case where not lemmatizing would strengthen your analysis.
If I can jump in, I think it would really depend on what kinds of features of the text you are most interested in. So if you're especially interested in things like orthography, and you want to capture the fact that, oh my god, there's so many different spellings, then there's an argument for not normalizing. However, even then, I think you'd still want some form of normalization or lemmatization to at least track down all the different spellings, because it is very difficult to know off the top of your head exactly how people are spelling things, even if there are certain patterns to the different varieties. I mean, it's such a problem in medieval Scots, because I swear they do it as a feature of their texts, where they like to have as many different spellings as possible of certain words to demonstrate just how educated they are, in a really weird inversion of how we think about spelling now, where they just want loads and loads of variety. But that's a possibility. Phonological analysis of text as well, matching kind of a pronunciation of words to spellings as a way to try and figure out how words used to sound. That's also a case where you maybe don't want any kind of normalized spelling in there, but in my opinion, it's always a good thing to have, especially if there's a way to separate it from your main text so that you can preserve original spellings but have normalized forms that you can search. This is something that Voyant is not so good at doing. which is a problem where if you have annotation in your text, Voyant really doesn't seem to have a way of accessing it. You can transform your text, so it's just the normalized form or the lemmatized form and put that in, but you can't kind of have them both together. You can't search both, where with other tools you potentially can. But other tools are also not as easy and user-friendly as Voyant. So it's always a, which evil do you go with?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to be honest, I'm not, I think always in all my research scenarios, I would have lemmatized the texts because, but it really depends. I mean, in general, like there's like different ways of standardization of a text, like what differences are important to you. When you, it really depends on what you're studying. So I can imagine there are maybe scenarios where you really care about is a plural used or not, for example. So maybe if you look at polite forms or not polite forms, maybe lemmatization might kind of have a function there. So it's really a question, I think, there about anticipating the consequence of what you're doing. And in general, like I think people, when you use digital text analysis, you want to kind of, often things become only visible after you uniformize every your text has a certain uniformity, which is basically like saying like base element of words. But again, in this process, you also remove a lot of information. So this is really dependent on what the question is in the end. So for me, I always lemmatization was a good option, but I can see it could also remove the information you want to find.
It's worth noting that with particularly with classical text, especially literary texts, as opposed to inscriptions of a papyri or whatever, when we're talking about lemmatization, we're not normally talking about normalization of spelling because these texts are already normalized by the tradition and the canon forming and so forth. But we're really talking just about flattening that distinction between singular and plural, flattening that distinction between subject and object. And those are things which can have an impact on the semantics of a text. They can have an impact on style. Very often they can obscure really interesting engrams because engrams may be much stronger. A particular word and another word in the nominative is a much stronger engram than that word in any other case, and vice versa. And in particular, when you're looking at stop words for sort of stylogrammetric or other sort of stylistic analysis, it's people have mentioned to me in the past that actually lemmatizing, you lose almost all distinction between these different authors. Whereas once you've got it unlemmatized, you get some really stark differences between them. So there are cases where lemmatizing really does lose a lot of distinctions. For most of the sort of things we're talking about, and especially for those of us who are playing with Voyant just because we want to see something cool and we don't have a deep computational linguistic approach, we probably will want to lematize because you get more interesting sort of results at that sort of shallow level. And I don't mean that pejoratively. But we'll see in 3 weeks' time in the session on applying computational approaches to studying Greek papyri, and specifically for the linguistic study. Lemmatization, I think, it will probably find that that obscures the sort of results they're looking for example. But I mean, I think to answer Elizabeth's question, for this week, we probably all want to lemmatize. We'll probably find more interesting things with a lemmatized text. On the other hand, lemmatizing, is a burden of time on us all. And if for your exercise this week, which we'll talk about in a minute, we work on the unlemmatized text as I did in my case study, then that's probably okay for sort of exploring it. If someone wanted to use this sort of text analysis and visualization as an assessed project, they probably would want to think about what the best way of doing this is, rather than just doing the easiest and first thing that comes to them. But these are distinctions we can talk about in more detail. For those of us who have classes doing this sort of thing, we can talk about that. Yeah, but I think yes, some of those. very different uses of large-scale text analysis. You know, I mean, as you say, Megan, text normalization is another issue again, and that's something in particular that the linguistic papyri people don't want to normalize the text, because that's what they're studying. They're precisely studying the changes in spelling which might impact on changes in grammar, changes in pronunciation, influence of other languages, you know, all sorts of things like that. Yeah. And yes, as Elizabeth says, the context and research question drives the answer to that question.
I mean, always. It always sounds a bit like a cop-out answer, but it is so true that what you do in your kind of text analysis project, the tools you use, the methods you use, they really need to be dictated by what you're interested in finding out, as well as, you know, other considerations like how much time you have, what are your resources, what are you willing to maybe learn how to do on your own, and do you have help doing more complicated things? It's I mean, we could think in an ideal world where we had loads of time and, you know, all the time in the world, that, you know, you could do it in every different way you wanted to, but sadly we don't live in that world.
Did you want to talk about the exercise briefly? Was that something someone was going to talk about?
Yes, yeah, sure. Should I share my slides again?
Yep.
Oh, there we go. So the exercise we've kind of put together for everyone is it's a very basic one of just upload a text or several texts into Voyant and just see what you can find. We've got a couple of possible resources for you to use. There's the Dionysus Ancient Greek corpus, of course. There's also the Oxford Text Archive, which is where I work, or you can use your own text that you're interested in. You can use a text that's in plain text, XML, HTML, PDF, or Word. Those all seem to work fine with Voyant. And just plug it into Voyant and try out, you know, as many of the tools and visualizations that you're interested in. Most of them are ones that Kaspar's introduced you to, but you actually can add others, and I might just quickly show you how. So in Voyant, let me see. So you can go to this little kind of almost Windows-like logo. You can click on that, and you have a whole list of loads and loads of other tools. For example, there's this one, bubble lines, which is another way of visualizing how frequently certain words occur. Or you can go to, what's another cool one? Loom is a bit nuts. I'm not entirely sure what it's doing, but it's certainly very colorful. But yeah, just give it a look, see what you find interesting, what you find helpful. They have another weird tool that I tried out, which is like this little chat bot called Visualiza, that I've not found very helpful, but I have found very entertaining. So just give it a go, see what you find, and then just think a bit about, you know, what's working well, what didn't work so well, what can you now, what is this telling you about the text, and would you have known that about the text from traditional methods, or is this unearthing something new? And then again, think a bit more about, you know, what kinds of questions and texts is this really well suited for, and what kind of questions and texts is this not well suited for, just to sort of help you get into the mindset of understanding what are the right tools and methods for you to use for your own research question. And I'm just going to finish up with a really quick plug of the Oxford Text Archive, just to let you know kind of what it is. I know you've been introduced to it before, but I'll just do it quickly again. So the Oxford Text Archive is a national repository for literary and linguistic data. It's the oldest continuously operating archive of digital resources for literary and linguistic research. We have over 4, that's actually not right. That number is very low. I need to revise this slide. It's actually over 70,000 texts from a range of time periods that are generally available and free to use. We have some text, some Latin and Greek texts as well. Some of them are very old. They're like from the 70s and 80s, from before Unicode. So there's been some weird transliteration done to kind of represent Greek letters when ASCII doesn't contain Greek letters. So it's maybe don't use the old ones. But we do have quite a few, and it's a resource that's committed to FAIR data principles, which is data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it's also connected to a variety of European networks, which means that any data that you deposit with us, or that anyone deposits with us for that matter, is also visible to broader European consortiums, which really helps it allows the world to kind of see what you're working on. It makes your research more accessible and thus have higher impact. So you can find us at that link, this LLDS link. And as I said, use the core collection, not the legacy collection, if you're looking for Greek and Latin texts. If you have any other questions or just interested, you can always email me and I'll be happy to talk to you more about it.
Thanks, Megan. Could you put the previous slide on the about the exercise back up?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I need to leave now.
Thank you.
Thank you all. If you have any questions, you know where to find me, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
See you, Kaspar.
Bye. See you. Bye.
Yeah, I was just going to add about this exercise that. Firstly, this exercise, for those of you who've been following the whole semester, this exercise builds on the first two sessions. So the first session we talked a lot about places you can find texts, of which the Oxford Text Archive and Dionysus are two examples. Perseus, Gutenberg, others were many other examples. And the second session, which was about cleaning of text. And that, in particular, is important if you want to use a text that contains other kinds of information. If you put up a text that still has line numbers into Voyant, it'll tell you that the number 5 occurs a lot in your text. It's one of the most frequent words in your text, and that's noise you kind of want to get rid of. So that's something you'll want to clean beforehand. The Dionysus ancient Greek corpus is a fantastic source of lemmatized text, as we discussed back in week 2. But if you try and drop the Dionysus corpus in there, you'll find the by far the most frequent word that occurs in there is the word word, because every single word is in an XML tag which has the name word. So that's something you'll need to clean up before you start. You'll need, if you want the lemma rather than the form of a word in there, you'll need to use regular expression to delete the rest of the line and keep only the lemma. And you might want to do a second pass to do the same thing with punctuation, and then to insert line breaks in useful places, so you've got your text in a useful form. So there's all sorts of things you might want to clean up as you go through. If you use a text, a source like Perseus or Gutenberg, you might have slightly less cleaning up to do. With Dionysus and Oxford Text Archive, you'll have a lot of cleaning up to do. So it's a bit of, we discussed all this a few weeks ago, but this is something you'll want to look at. If you go back to my slide on, so I don't know if you can go back to slide 27, Megan. Just for an example. The links to Elian's NA to download and the lemmatized forms, those are pre-prepared, pre-cleaned up. If you wanted to play with those, for example, those are in Greek, they're in Unicode Greek. There's all sorts of other texts that are in Latin or English or what other language that you can find somewhere else. But these are just some more examples of things to play with. But I think I would strongly urge you to combine this session with the exercises from session 1 and 2, finding the text you're interested in, cleaning them up in the fairly, the more advanced ways that we discussed then, and then loading them into Voyant and getting better results from them.
Great. So I don't see any other questions in the chat, other than to say thank you for Kaspar, who's already left. So the next Sunoikisis session will be on the 6th of March, next Thursday, which will be talking about working with digital editions of the cuneiform texts, including in particular the CDLI, the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. So yeah, thank you very much again to Megan and to Kaspar for joining us for this session today, and I hope everybody watching enjoyed it as well and has fun visualizing some of these texts with Voyant. Great, so bye.
Thank you very much.